Welcome back to a little bit of philosophy. This is Philosophy 101, Unit 4, Lecture 3, Aristotle and Virtue Ethics. Having now completed our investigation of metaethics in the last two-part video, we're now ready to return to the normative side of ethical theory. Remember, this is the part of ethical theory that contains all the various competing moral theories put forward by various philosophers over the course of Western philosophical history. We organize these theories under three main headings: teleological, deontological, and virtue theories. The teleological, or consequentialist theories like hedonism, egoism, and utilitarianism, all claim that goodness is to be found in some consequence of our actions. These are the theories that hold that the ends justify the means. The deontological theories, like Kantianism, existentialism, Stoicism, and the divine command theory, reject the teleological approach of the consequentialist theories, holding that the ends never justify the means. Virtue theories reject the rule-based orientation of both the teleological and deontological families, arguing that character formation should be the central concern of moral theory. And it's with this approach that we begin our investigation of normative ethics. Now, you may recall that the axiological shift in Western philosophy really got underway with Socrates in the mid-5th century BCE. If the early Platonic dialogues are an accurate portrayal of his views, Socrates seemed to have held that we ought to strive to be virtuous or excellent human beings. But he seems to have held that virtue, or human excellence, is a kind of knowledge. Further, he seems to have held that this knowledge was sufficient for actually being virtuous. This intellectualist view of morality meant that if one knew what, say, courage was, then she could not fail to be courageous. Thus, for Socrates, there was no such thing as weakness of the will, since knowledge of virtue alone would cause us to be virtuous. Plato, Socrates' most famous disciple, built on this view and found a way to incorporate weakness of the will into his moral theory. Like Socrates, he thinks of virtue as a kind of knowledge, but it was possible to possess the knowledge that would make one virtuous while not being able to act on that knowledge. This follows from his tripartite theory of the soul, which held that the rational part of the soul, the one that contained innate knowledge of virtue, is often overpowered by the appetitive or spirited parts. In order to be virtuous, the rational part of the soul must be in control, directing the appetites and spirit toward their proper ends. Unfortunately, for most of us, we're controlled by our appetites, or our spirit, so even though we possess the innate knowledge necessary to be virtuous, we don't act upon it. Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, will be influenced by the intellectualist tradition of Socrates and Plato, but he will, as we'll see in a moment, move in a different direction. But before we turn to Aristotle, we should first stop and note what exactly these philosophers mean by virtue. The Greek word translated virtue, or more precisely excellence, is arete. This is why this branch of normative ethics is sometimes called aretaic ethics. A virtue is a disposition of one's character that is praiseworthy. It's what makes a person an excellent example of being human. And for the ancient Greeks, there were 5 cardinal or chief virtues: courage, temperance, justice, wisdom, and piety. You should note that all of them are social in nature. For an ancient Greek, to be a good person meant being a good citizen of the polis or city-state, as there was nothing like a Greek nation in the ancient period. To be a good citizen meant that you might be called upon to defend the city against its enemies. It also meant that you should be in control of yourself and deal appropriately with fellow citizens. Wisdom was also thought to be a central feature of an excellent citizen, especially in Athens, since you were expected to participate in the governing of the city, since Athens was one of the few democracies in the ancient world. And of course, it would have been considered essential to live in harmony with the gods of the city, so that they in turn would watch over it and make it prosperous. So when Socrates and Plato refer to virtue, they mean this collection of character traits that would qualify you to be a good citizen. Aristotle also thought that virtue was central to what we would call morality, and while he was influenced by both Socrates and Plato before him, his theory of virtue, from which we get our notion of virtue ethics, would differ significantly from both of them. Aristotle came to Athens and joined Plato's academy when he was about 18 and quickly established himself as a genius on a level with his teacher, Plato. But Aristotle rejected metaphysical dualism, and therefore the theory of the tripartite soul. For him, the soul was just the animating force of a living body, and there was nothing immortal about it, as there was for Plato. Thus, there was no reason to believe that we have innate knowledge of how to live. In fact, Aristotle's entire approach to the nature of existence, or ontology, was a radical departure from Plato's. For Plato, the immaterial or immortal ideas, or universals as we call them, were the cause of the myriad particular objects that exist in what he called the realm of becoming. Ideas, or the forms as they are sometimes called, were ontologically prior to and superior to particular things. But for Aristotle, ontology must begin with the particular, not the universal. Aristotle labeled particulars primary substances. These are the things that take modification, but are not used to modify other things. Secondary substances are the things that modify primary substances. For example, Socrates is a primary substance. He is the thing that we say things about. For example, we could say that he's human, that he's an animal, that he's a living being, or even more abstractly, a being. The properties we attribute to primary substances are secondary substances. Socrates is the particular, human is the universal. For Plato, it was the universal that caused the particular, but for Aristotle, it's the opposite. We discover the universal in the particular object. When we examine what a primary substance is, we discover that it's a combination of two different substances, the matter, or stuff that it's made of, and the form that the matter takes. Now, this might sound like Plato's view, but for Aristotle, the form is not an independently existing immortal idea. It's simply the set of qualities we find in the particular, which are shared by other particulars of the same kind. But how does this combination of matter and form come to exist? Aristotle holds that there are four distinct answers to the question, why is this thing what it is? First, there's the stuff of which it's made. This is the material cause. But the matter is in a particular form, which makes it distinct from other primary substances made of the same stuff. This is the formal cause of the thing. The efficient cause is the antecedent condition or set of conditions that put the matter into a particular form. But the explanation Aristotle provides doesn't end there. Everything that exists, according to Aristotle, has a function, an end, a purpose, and this is its final cause. And as we're about to see, it's this final cause, the purpose of a thing, that is of critical importance to understanding his theory of virtue. Now, when it comes to ends, for Aristotle, there are two distinct kinds of ends that we need to keep in mind. An intermediate end is that which is aimed at for the sake of or securing something else, while the final end is that at which intermediate ends ultimately aim. As an example, Aristotle uses the various types of knowledge that are used within a state. He calls this social science, or the knowledge of a society. Within a state, there are many different kinds of expertise, or knowledge of how to do things. Economics is the knowledge of how to order an economy. Strategy is the knowledge of how to achieve success over competing societies. Rhetoric is the knowledge of how to persuade your fellow citizens through public speak. And medicine is the knowledge of how to achieve health for the citizens of the state. But the end of each of these individual species of knowledge is not good in itself. Each is only good for the purpose of achieving the greater good. The knowledge which aims at the final end of the state is politics. To put it in Socratic language, politics would be a kind of episteme, while the other forms of knowledge would be technes, necessary to achieve the final end. But this leads us to the big question. What is the end of political knowledge? What is its telos? What is its function? The final end of politics, the ultimate goal of the state, is to establish the conditions for the happiness of its citizens. Now, the ancient Greek word, usually translated happiness, is a mashup of two words, eu meaning good and daimon meaning demon. We, of course, associate the word demon with an evil being, but that was not the case in ancient Greek culture. So the word eudaimonia, in its most literal sense, meant having a divine being that made everything work out for the best. If you had a good demon looking out for you, your life was going to go well. By the time we get to the classical period of ancient Greece, the word had come to mean just that, doing well, or reaching your highest potential, or flourishing. So when Aristotle talks about happiness, he's not referring to the subjective psychological state that we think of when we think of the word happiness. He means flourishing, reaching your highest potential. But what is it that causes us to flourish? Ordinary people associate happiness with pleasure. But for Aristotle, this is too base. Now, aristocrats associate flourishing with wealth or honor, but these can't be ends in themselves, since wealth is used to secure other ends, and honor is something that isn't really possessed by the recipient. It only exists in the mind of those who bestow it. And just as honor can be given, it can be taken away, so it's never really possessed by the person who is honored. To understand what it means to be happy, Aristotle argues that we first must know what it means to be human. Only then can we understand what it means to flourish as a human. This brings us back to his teleology, his theory of ends. Each kind of thing has an end, and to do well means to fulfill that end. So for living things, to understand their end, we must understand the kind of soul or life force that they have. Plants, the simplest living things, have a nutritive soul. Their end is to take in water and nutrients, to grow, and to reproduce. If they have everything that they need in the appropriate amounts, they will flourish. They will be happy. They will be eudaimon. Animals have a sensate soul, that is, a soul that requires the exercise of the senses to achieve the food and mates that they need to reach their maximum potential. Now, many animals do this individually, but there are some animals that do this in groups. These social animals require their community to reach their maximum potential, to be happy, to be eudaimon. Humans, of course, are also animals. We have senses, and we're also social animals. But unlike other social animals, we do not have an instinct for creating our communities. We have an additional ability that makes us distinct from other social animals. We have reason. It's only through the application of reason that human beings can form the social groups which enable them to achieve their final ends. Of course, not every social organization is going to be best at helping us to achieve that final end, which is why some kinds of social organizations are better than others. And this is precisely what Aristotle takes up in the Politics. But that's another conversation. For now, we can say that reason is necessary in order to form the appropriate kinds of social organizations that enable individuals within that community to live fully as humans. So for Aristotle, humans are the rational, political animal. Now that we know that directing our actions according to reason is the end of human existence, that it is good to live the rational life, we only have to determine how to go about doing that. Aristotle divides human excellence, or virtue, into two distinct kinds. There are virtues of the mind, or intellectual virtues, and there are virtues of character, or dispositions to act in certain ways. Intellectual virtues, like being good at math, are acquired through education. But dispositional excellence can only be achieved through practice, like playing a musical instrument. One can study musical theory and the physics of, say, a violin, and one could even become an expert in these subjects, but that doesn't mean that when they pick up the violin, they'll actually be able to play it. Being an excellent violinist, a virtuoso, requires years of practice. The same is true for the moral virtues, or virtues of character, and this brings us to an important observation. Simply acting in a virtuous manner does not mean that one is a virtuous person. One might, for example, act in a way that is consistent with what we would identify as virtue, but merely performing the act, which is virtuous, does not mean that the actor is virtuous. Excellence requires intention on the part of the agent. They must desire to act in a virtuous manner. But this requires that they know what is and what isn't virtuous. Their will must be guided by the rational comprehension that what they are doing is being done because it's virtuous. Further still, the virtuous person must be consistent in their disposition to act virtuously. Again, if we think of the violinist, we can see why this is. Just because a violinist occasionally plays well does not make them a virtuoso. It does not make them excellent. We would expect an excellent violinist to be consistently, though perhaps not perfectly, good at playing. Thus, for Aristotle, moral virtue or excellence of character is the state of deliberate moral purpose consisting of a rational mean relative to our character. Now, we should remind ourselves here that Aristotle does not believe anyone is virtuous by nature. We have the potential as rational animals to direct our actions according to reason. But what are we aiming for? What exactly is the excellence we're trying to achieve? For Aristotle, it is the mean that lies between the extremes of our potential behavior. Let's consider the virtue of courage. What is it? It's part of a continuum of possible human behavior. At one end lies cowardice, or a deficiency of courage. At the other end would lie foolhardiness, or having too much courage. What we are looking for, the virtue, is actually what lies between the extremes. It is the mean between cowardliness and foolhardiness. So how do we achieve this mean? How do we become an excellent human being? The same way one would become an excellent violinist, by practice. We know that virtue is the opposite of vice, and we know that vice, according to Aristotle, is either too much or too little of the desired disposition. So, to become a moral virtuoso, we must practice acting according to the mean. Since none of us are actually born virtuous, we are likely to find ourselves naturally falling somewhere on the scale closer to deficiency or excess. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that I'm naturally more timid than others. I have a deficiency of courage. How do I fix that problem? I know that I need more courage than I have, so I aim at what seems to be an excessively courageous action, a foolhardy action. But of course, since I'm already on the timid side of the scale to begin with, What seems like too much courage will actually fall short of foolhardiness. By embracing what seems foolhardy to me, I discovered that, in fact, my action was not actually foolhardy at all. But of course, I'm not finished yet. I still have too little courage. I must again aim for what I take to be the opposite extreme of my position, which moves me closer to the mean. By continually trying to balance my actions between the extremes, I eventually find the mean, through repeated practice, becomes my habituated state. Like the violinist, I no longer have to think about where to put my fingers or how to draw the bow. I do it because it has become my habitualized practice. So let's summarize what we've learned in this very brief exploration of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We've learned that he rejects Plato's metaphysical dualism and also his theory of the immortal soul. Thus, the rational component of virtue will not be innate as it was for his teacher. Aristotle's approach also differs from Plato. His approach to the world is teleological, in the sense that everything has a function, and to understand something requires us to understand its end. We should note that this is a different application of the term teleological than the one we use when we describe other moral theories, those theories that claim that the ends justify the means. Aristotle's moral theory is a virtue theory, not a consequentialist theory, but it is guided by the concept of teleology, that things aim at an end. Now, when we apply this to human beings, we discover that they are rational, political animals. That means that they need community in order to achieve their end. They need reason to achieve their end. And flourishing as a rational political animal is the goal of human life. But since humans are dependent on reason instead of instinct to achieve their natural end, they must develop dispositions of excellence to achieve happiness. These divide into two different kinds: intellectual virtues, which are attained through education, as well as moral virtues, or dispositions of character, which can only be attained through continual practice. It is this emphasis upon character that makes virtue ethics so distinct from both consequentialism and deontology, which will both rely heavily on moral principles to guide our actions in order to achieve the moral life. And we'll turn to those alternative branches of normative ethics in our next videos. So be sure to come back again as we continue to learn a little bit of philosophy.